In the spring of 1945, Europe entered the final chapter of World War II, but this was not only a season of victory, it was also a season when moral boundaries began to blur, like paint peeling from a wall that had endured years of shelling. From the east, Soviet armies surged into the heart of Germany. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces closed in. The Third Reich was collapsing piece by piece, and even the most fanatical Nazi defenders could sense that defeat was inevitable. Yet, at the very moment when the war seemed close to ending, a disturbing pattern began to appear on the battlefields. In some documented cases, SS soldiers who dropped their weapons and raised their hands were no longer treated as ordinary prisoners of war, and a number of them were shot after surrendering. This did not happen in just one place. American, British, Canadian, and across different Allied armies, many soldiers came to a similar conclusion over time. SS men were not viewed as ordinary soldiers, but as part of an organization known for extreme brutality. On paper, official reports used careful language. Shot while attempting to escape. Casualties during the confusion of combat. But the reality was simpler, and far darker. There were documented incidents in which Allied soldiers killed SS troops who had already surrendered, especially during the final months of the war. Sometimes it happened in the heat of battle, and sometimes it happened after a cold, silent pause. In some cases, officers did not pursue investigations or disciplinary action, especially when events occurred during the confusion of fast-moving combat. Why did the rules of war, meant to protect human dignity, collapse just as the war was ending? What made a black uniform enough to erase the right to live as a prisoner? The answer is not found in a single cause. It was built over years of war. The SS's carefully cultivated reputation for brutality, the atrocities Allied soldiers learned about or witnessed, the real danger SS units still posed even when surrendering. And finally, later, the shock and horror that Allied troops experienced when they entered concentration camps such as Dachau further reinforced these attitudes toward the SS. What began in 1925 as Hitler's personal bodyguard had, by 1945, become something far beyond a military force. In the eyes of those who faced them, the SS had become a criminal organization in uniform, one that many soldiers believed had surrendered any claim to the protections of civilized warfare. In the beginning, back in 1925, when Adolf Hitler first created his Schutzstaffel, the organization consisted of only 8 men whose sole duty was to stand close to Hitler and protect him from danger. These early bodyguards were led by Julius Schreck, a loyal follower who escorted Hitler to beer halls and political rallies across Munich. For several years, the SS remained a minor group inside the Nazi Party, overshadowed by the much larger Sturmabteilung, or SA, which carried out most Nazi street violence. Everything changed in January 1929, when Hitler appointed Heinrich Himmler to lead the SS. At that time, the organization had fewer than 300 members, but Himmler already imagined something far greater. Himmler believed he could build an elite force based not only on military skill, but on racial purity and absolute loyalty to Hitler. He introduced strict entry requirements, forcing candidates to prove they had no Jewish ancestry and met harsh physical standards meant to reflect Nazi racial ideas. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS developed the idea of absolute loyalty, which later became officially expressed in the motto, "Meine Ehre heißt Treue," or "My honor is loyalty." This was not a slogan, but a demand that loyalty to Hitler come before law, morality, or even personal survival. The SS gained real power during the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934, when Hitler turned against Ernst Röhm and the SA leadership. Fearing Röhm's influence and talk of a second revolution, Hitler ordered the SS to act. Over one violent weekend, SS units arrested and executed dozens of leading figures from the SA, including Ernst Röhm, while the total number of victims is estimated by historians to be between several dozen and a few hundred. As a reward, Hitler declared the SS an independent organization loyal only to him, a decision that allowed it to grow into a far more dangerous force. With this new status, Himmler expanded the SS beyond political policing. In late 1934, he formed armed SS units trained both militarily and ideologically. Army officers viewed this development with distrust, but Hitler wanted troops who showed the same devotion the SS had proven during the Purge. By the time the war began in 1939, armed SS units already existed, and in 1940 these forces were officially reorganized and named the Waffen-SS by Hitler's order. Although it began with several large units that were not yet full divisions, the Waffen-SS later expanded and developed into a force made up of many divisions during the war. It eventually grew into a force of hundreds of thousands of men who swore personal loyalty to Hitler rather than to Germany itself. What separated the Waffen-SS from regular soldiers was the intensity of their indoctrination. Beyond weapons training, SS recruits were taught to see war as a racial struggle with no room for mercy. They were told they represented the highest form of the German race and that hesitation was a betrayal of honor. This belief made them fierce fighters, but it also removed moral limits from their actions. The Waffen-SS often received better equipment than regular army units, including advanced machine guns and heavily armored tanks. This special treatment reflected Hitler's belief that they were his elite force. SS soldiers also carried visible marks of membership, including collar insignia and blood-type tattoos applied during training. These tattoos were meant to save lives, but as the SS became known for widespread atrocities, they turned into deadly evidence. After the war, Allied soldiers learned to look for these marks, and for many former SS men, after the war, Allied forces used these tattoos to identify former SS members, and they often led to arrest or investigation. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's own Guard regiment, rolled into Poland alongside regular German army units in September 1939 during Operation Fall Weiss, or Case White, and almost immediately, reports began filtering back to army headquarters about SS actions that violated the accepted rules of war, though at this early stage, few people understood that these incidents represented not aberrations, but rather a preview of how the SS would conduct itself throughout the conflict. In the town of Błony, Leibstandarte soldiers were reported to have rounded up dozens of Polish Jews and shot them without any military justification, in what later investigations described as a deliberate massacre, and in Złoczew, SS men used machine guns to massacre an estimated 200 civilians, including women and children, who posed no threat to German military operations, and these were not accidents of combat or the unfortunate casualties that occur in any war, but deliberate killings that served no tactical purpose beyond terror and racial hatred. The German army generals who reviewed these early reports expressed concern about the SS's performance for multiple reasons, and yes, the atrocities troubled some of them, though perhaps not as many as later generations might hope, but they also worried about the SS's tactical competence in purely military terms. Wehrmacht officers noted that SS units took unnecessary risks in combat, suffered higher casualty rates than regular formations, and often had to be rescued when their aggressive tactics led them into traps, and at Pabianice, the Leibstandarte became surrounded by Polish forces and required intervention by a regular army regiment to break free. This incident was cited as evidence that SS men's fanatical bravery could not compensate for proper military training, and the SS defended itself by arguing that it had been forced to fight in small detachments rather than as unified formations, and that the army had failed to provide adequate heavy weapons. But the tension between the army and the SS had been established, and would never fully heal. In May 1940, when Hitler turned his armies west against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the SS again demonstrated both its fighting prowess and its capacity for actions that existed in a grey area between military necessity and criminal brutality. In the early hours of the morning on May 10, 1940, the Leibstandarte Division crossed the Dutch border as part of Germany's Western Offensive, and by the end of the day, the division had advanced more than 70 kilometers, capturing key crossings and urban areas with a speed that impressed many army commanders, capturing key crossings and urban areas with a speed that impressed even skeptical army commanders, and the division drove west toward Rotterdam. Although German forces advanced rapidly across the Netherlands, The Hague was not captured, and Dutch resistance continued for several days before the government agreed to surrender. This success showed that the Waffen-SS could fight effectively when properly deployed, but it also convinced Hitler and Himmler that they needed to expand these forces even further. And by July 19, 1940, Hitler publicly used the term Waffen-SS in a speech, giving these combat formations an official and distinct military identity to describe these combat formations, giving them an official designation that recognized their status as a separate military force. The pattern that would eventually seal the SS's fate was already emerging in these early campaigns, though the full implications would not become clear for several more years. SS units fought with exceptional aggression and determination, but they also committed acts that regular army troops generally avoided, and word of these incidents spread through the Allied ranks faster than official intelligence reports could document them. A British soldier who might have been named something like Thomas Whitmore had worked as a mechanic in Liverpool before the war, and encountered SS troops during the fighting in France, could have experienced something that taught him lessons about these distinctive enemy soldiers that would shape how he viewed them for the rest of his life. Some Allied soldiers later recalled incidents in which German troops appeared to surrender and then suddenly resumed fighting, experiences that contributed to deep suspicion toward SS units and attack their captors, or SS men would use white flags to approach Allied positions and then open fire when soldiers came out to accept their capitulation. Whether these were deliberate tactics taught in SS training or simply individual decisions made by fanatical soldiers who preferred death to capture remained unclear, but the effect was the same. Allied troops began to approach any SS surrender with extreme suspicion, and that suspicion would later manifest in deadly ways. We'd seen regular German soldiers throw down their rifles and put their hands up proper-like. One British veteran reportedly said years after the war, but these SS lads were different somehow, and you never quite knew if they were really giving up or just setting a trap. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, sending millions of German soldiers crashing into the Soviet Union in what would become the most brutal theater of the entire war, and the Waffen-SS played a prominent role in the invasion, while separate SS security units carried out additional tasks that went beyond normal military operations, and these forces often worked alongside the regular army. SS units followed behind the advancing combat troops with orders to carry out what Nazi documents euphemistically called special tasks of a police nature, which in reality meant the systematic murder of Soviet political commissars, Communist Party members, Jews, Roma, and anyone else the Nazi regime deemed racially or politically undesirable. These Einsatzgruppen, which were mobile killing squads under SS Security Command, followed behind the front lines and carried out mass shootings across occupied Soviet territory, moved from village to village across occupied Soviet territory, assembling their victims in town squares or forest clearings and shooting them into mass graves that the victims themselves had been forced to dig. And by the end of the war, historians estimate that these units were responsible for the deaths of more than 1 million people, most of whom were Jewish civilians. The Waffen-SS divisions fighting at the front also participated in what the Germans called anti-partisan warfare, which too often meant the indiscriminate murder of civilians in any area where resistance fighters operated, and when partisans attacked German convoys or sabotaged railway lines, SS commanders would order entire villages burned and their inhabitants shot, arguing that the population must be supporting the resistance and therefore shared responsibility for partisan actions. The mathematics of these reprisals revealed their true nature. If partisans killed one German soldier, the SS might execute 50 or 100 civilians in response, and these killings had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with terror and racial ideology. And the Red Army soldiers who eventually pushed the Germans back westward found the burned villages and mass graves, and they learned to recognize the SS units that had committed these atrocities. The Commissar Order, issued by Hitler and enthusiastically implemented by the SS, directed that Soviet political commissars attached to Red Army units should be shot immediately upon capture, rather than treated as prisoners of war, and this order transformed the conflict on the Eastern Front into something that went beyond normal warfare and approached mutual extermination. Soviet soldiers learned that surrendering to SS units was extremely dangerous, and many believed it often meant death, which pushed them to fight with desperate determination, so they fought with a desperation born of knowing they had no choice, and when the tide of battle eventually turned and Soviet forces began capturing SS men, in some cases Soviet troops executed captured SS men in retaliation, although this was not an official policy and did not occur in every situation. A story like that of a fictional Soviet soldier, used here as an example, reflects real events in which SS units carried out collective punishments against entire villages, perhaps from Stalingrad, who joined the Red Army after his hometown was reduced to rubble in 1942, could have learned after the war that when partisans attacked a German supply convoy near his sister's village, the SS had responded by herding the entire population into the village church and burning it to the ground with everyone inside. This type of collective punishment was not unusual. SS anti-partisan operations across the occupied Soviet territories followed a consistent pattern where the murder of civilians was not an unfortunate side effect, but rather the intended outcome, a deliberate strategy to terrorize the population into submission, and when Soviet forces eventually pushed the Germans back westward, they passed through hundreds of these destroyed villages, and they found the mass graves where the SS had shot Jews, Communist Party members, and anyone else they deemed undesirable. The conflict between the Waffen-SS and the Red Army became a war of mutual extermination, where neither side showed mercy or expected to receive it, because the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union with explicit orders from Hitler that this would be a war unlike any other. A racial struggle where the normal constraints of civilized warfare did not apply, and the SS implemented these orders with particular enthusiasm. When the tide of battle turned and Soviet forces began capturing SS men, they shot them with a casual brutality that matched what the SS had inflicted on Soviet prisoners. And this pattern would continue all the way to Berlin. With the distinctive SS runes and blood group tattoos, these markings often led to immediate identification and harsh treatment, although they did not automatically result in execution. The winter of 1944 brought desperate times for Nazi Germany as Allied armies closed in from all directions, and Adolf Hitler gambled everything on one final offensive that he hoped would split British and American forces, and Adolf Hitler gambled everything on one final offensive that he hoped would split British and American forces, seize the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into negotiations. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, attacking through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and catching American units by surprise. Leading the northern thrust was the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, an experienced officer known for aggressive tactics and rapid advances, a veteran officer known for aggressive tactics and ruthless speed. Peiper's battle group, or Kampfgruppe, consisted of roughly 5,000 men supported by tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry, and their orders were simple but unforgiving. Advance west as fast as possible toward the Meuse River, opening the way for follow-on forces as part of the broader plan to reach Antwerp. Speed mattered above all else. On December 17th, Peiper's forces rolled through the Ardennes, capturing the town of Honsfeld and seizing a small American fuel depot at Büllingen. At both locations, American prisoners were taken, and later testimony indicated that some prisoners were reportedly killed, possibly to prevent delays during the rapid advance. These killings were only a warning of what would happen later that same day. Around midday on December 17th, near the Bonnier crossroads southeast of Malmedy, Piper's column encountered an American convoy moving south. It belonged to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a unit composed mainly of support troops performing routine transport duties. They were not front-line combat soldiers, and when German tanks appeared, the Americans had no realistic way to resist. After a brief firefight lasting less than 20 minutes, the American commander ordered his men to surrender. About 113 soldiers laid down their weapons. The Germans gathered the prisoners in an open field near the crossroads and ordered them to stand in the snow. The Americans believed they would be sent to the rear as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, which they assumed still applied. They waited for a period of time in the open field, uncertain but still believing they would be treated as prisoners of war, stamping their feet against the cold, uncertain but hopeful. Then, without warning, German machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore through the unarmed prisoners as men fell where they stood or tried desperately to run. Some fled toward nearby woods and were shot in the back, while others dropped to the ground and pretended to be dead beneath fallen bodies. When the machine gun fire stopped, SS soldiers walked among the wounded, shooting anyone who moved with pistols at close range. Despite these efforts, several Americans survived by hiding among the dead or escaping into the forest. After nightfall, survivors reached Malmedy and reported the massacre to stunned American officers. The frozen bodies remained in the field until January 14, 1945, when advancing U.S. troops recovered them. Evidence confirmed the accounts. Many victims had been executed at close range. The final confirmed count reached at least 84 American prisoners who had been killed. The Malmedy massacre deeply affected American forces. Unofficially, many units stopped taking SS prisoners, and some issued direct orders to shoot SS troops on sight. Retaliatory killings followed, including the massacre of German prisoners near Chernonj on January 1, 1945. Although these acts violated the Geneva Convention, in some cases, commanders did not pursue full investigations, often citing the chaos of combat and the emotional impact of the Malmedy massacre, understanding how Malmedy had changed their soldiers forever. A fictional young American soldier, used here as a representative example, might have been a farm boy from Kansas who had grown up helping his family raise livestock, had grown up helping his father raise cattle and hogs, and he believed he understood death as well as any 22-year-old could. He had butchered animals, seen life leave their eyes, and learned not to think too deeply about it. Yet nothing in that rural life prepared him for a grey April afternoon in 1945, when his unit approached a place called Dachau, and the memories formed there would follow him for the rest of his life. The 157th Infantry Regiment was advancing through Bavaria in the final drive into southern Germany, and the men knew the war was nearly over, which made them both exhausted and eager to finish and go home. On April 29th, scouts reported a large camp ahead, and some soldiers initially believed the camp might be a prisoner of war facility, while others were unsure of its true purpose until they saw what lay ahead. As they approached from the southwest, they noticed a railway siding near the gate, where dozens of boxcars stood silent, and even before reaching them, the smell in the air warned that something was terribly wrong. When the Americans forced open the sealed doors, they found more than 30 boxcars filled with corpses, with historians estimating that roughly 1,200 to 1,600 bodies were inside. Some had been dead for weeks, others only days, and all showed signs of extreme starvation and abuse. Most of the victims had died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion, although some showed signs of violence and abuse before death, and the sight and smell overwhelmed even hardened veterans, men who had fought in North Africa and Italy and now bent over retching into the dirt. Inside the camp, the horror deepened. The soldiers found buildings with rooms filled floor to ceiling with naked corpses, a crematorium where bodies had been burned, and the soldiers also saw a room built to resemble a gas chamber, although later research showed it was not used for mass killings. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks later wrote that the stench of death was overpowering, and Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks later wrote that the scenes at Dachau were so horrific that ordinary language failed to describe them, not as exaggeration, but because language itself failed him. Roughly 30,000 prisoners were still alive, though many were so weak that they would soon die despite care. When they realized liberation had come, they surged toward the Americans, some lifting soldiers onto their shoulders despite barely having strength to stand. Others waved small Allied flags made in secret, crying with joy in a scene that mixed celebration and horror in equal measure. Not all SS guards had fled. A number of SS guards remained in the camp and attempted to surrender as American forces arrived, believing military law would protect them. Near the boxcars, 4 SS officers were marched inside at gunpoint, and moments later, gunshots echoed, leaving them dead among the bodies they had helped create. Soon after, more SS guards were lined up against a wall in the coal yard, and in the chaos and shock of the moment, American soldiers fired on a group of SS guards, killing several of them, an act later investigated by the US Army. This was not combat, but execution, carried out in the raw shock of what had just been discovered. Elsewhere, in a few cases, former prisoners attacked captured guards in acts of personal revenge after years of extreme abuse with tools and bare hands, settling accounts for years of cruelty. Later investigations acknowledged that international law had been violated, yet concluded that no prosecutions should follow, and no American soldier was ever tried for the killings at Dachau. The men who shot SS prisoners at Dachau and at other places across Europe carried those actions with them for the rest of their lives, and the weight of what they had done pressed on them in different ways, depending on who they were and how they understood their own choices. Some, like the imagined farm boy from Kansas, returned home and tried to live quiet, ordinary lives, going back to their fields, marrying, raising families, and rarely speaking about the war except in vague terms. Yet the memories never truly left, appearing in nightmares that grew stronger with age. And when children or grandchildren asked difficult questions, these men struggled to explain how soldiers raised to respect rules could take part in killing prisoners. One veteran reportedly told his children years later, "I'm not proud of what we did, but I'm not ashamed either because you weren't there. You didn't see the boxcars or walk through rooms filled with bodies. After seeing what they did, something inside you changes, and the rules that once mattered no longer feel strong enough when faced with that kind of evil." His words captured a feeling shared by many veterans who believed their actions could not be judged without understanding the moment itself. Other veterans chose a different path. Some turned to education and became teachers, hoping to explain war without glorifying it. They spoke about international law and the need for standards in wartime, but they also spoke honestly about places like Dachau and Malmedy, and about the impossible decisions soldiers sometimes faced. They did not offer simple answers, because they believed history rarely provides them. Senior officers also struggled with responsibility. Some commanders understood that while the killings could not be officially approved, punishing men who had just witnessed extreme atrocities would achieve little. There was an unspoken belief that the gap between written law and human endurance had become too wide to close in those final months of the war. Legally, the situation was clear. Killing surrendered prisoners violated the laws of war, but human reality was not so simple. The soldiers involved had just seen systematic murder on an unimaginable scale, and their response, while unlawful, may have been psychologically unavoidable. Law could define the crime, but it could not fully explain the moment. The Malmedy massacre trial, conducted from May to July 1946 in the same Dachau camp where so many had died, attempted to bring some legal accounting to at least one of the SS's many crimes. The Malmedy massacre trial, held from May to July 1946 at the former Dachau campsite, brought more than 70 SS defendants before a US Army tribunal. The defendants included SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, who commanded the 6th Panzer Army during the offensive, and they also included Joachim Peiper, whose battle group was tied to the killings at the Baugnier Crossroads, and SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, whose battle group was closely linked to the murders at the Baugnier Crossroads, whose battle group had actually committed the murders at Baugnier Crossroads, and the prosecutors argued that these murders were premeditated, the result of orders from Hitler himself that the offensive should be prosecuted with ruthless brutality to terrorize the Allies into seeking peace. On July 16, 1946, the tribunal convicted the defendants, and it issued dozens of death sentences alongside life terms and long prison sentences. But the story did not end there, because the defendants continued to insist they had been tortured into confessing, and after the trial, the defendants claimed their confessions were coerced, and later reviews and political pressure helped drive sentence reductions, even as the case remained controversial, particularly in Germany and among some Americans who worried about the fairness of the military justice system. Over the following decade, all of the death sentences were commuted through a combination of legal appeals and political pressure, and Peiper's sentence was reduced to 35 years in 1954 before he was released in December 1956, having served just over 10 years for his role in the murder of 84 American prisoners. Dietrich was paroled in the mid-1950s, and after later legal trouble in a separate case, he was released again in 1959 due to serious health problems. Over the following years, every death sentence was commuted, and most of the convicted men were eventually released, with Peiper leaving prison in December 1956, which meant that the SS soldiers who murdered American prisoners of war received more mercy from the American justice system than they had shown to their victims. Some SS members escaped justice entirely by avoiding capture in the chaotic final days of the war, and the blood group tattoo that had been meant to save lives by enabling quick medical treatment instead became a mark of death that many SS veterans tried desperately to remove. Some attempted surgery, cutting the skin away, and hoping the scar would be less damaging than the tattoo itself, while others used chemicals to burn the tattoo off, accepting permanent scarring as preferable to being identified as SS. A few even shot themselves in the arm, creating wounds that would destroy the tattoo area while providing a plausible story about combat injuries. After the war, Allied and US authorities often checked the inner left arm for the SS blood group tattoo, and US immigration officials later used it as one clue to identify former Waffen-SS members. Some notorious SS members who lacked the tattoo managed to slip through the nets that Allied authorities cast for war criminals, and some notorious SS men avoided capture through false papers and support networks, and the absence of the SS blood group tattoo could also make identification harder, which is one reason figures like Josef Mengele and Alois Brunner were able to stay hidden for years, and these men and others like them blended back into civilian life, taking on new identities and living out their years free from prosecution, and their escape left a bitter taste for survivors who had hoped that justice would catch all the perpetrators of Nazi crimes. In the decades since the war ended, historians and ethicists have continued to debate whether the Allied soldiers who shot SS prisoners were justified in their actions, or whether they simply became war criminals themselves, and there are no easy answers to these questions that would satisfy everyone. Those who argue that the executions were unjustified point to the clear language of critics, point to the Geneva Rules on prisoners of war, which require captives to be protected from violence, and forbid reprisals, even while allowing suspected war criminals to be tried through a legal process. And they argue that if the Allies were truly fighting for justice and the rule of law, they should have upheld those principles even when dealing with the worst enemies. From this perspective, every SS man who was shot after surrendering represents a failure of Allied ideals and a stain on the record of the soldiers who liberated Europe. A third perspective, which may be the most honest, if also the most uncomfortable, acknowledges that both views contain truth, and that the situation cannot be reduced to simple categories of right and wrong. Yes, the soldiers who shot SS prisoners violated the laws of war that they were supposedly defending, and their commanders who looked the other way became complicit in those violations. And yes, those soldiers were responding to genuine horrors and operating under extreme stress that few people today can fully comprehend, having witnessed atrocities that would traumatize anyone exposed to them. The shooting of SS prisoners was neither simply justified nor simply criminal, but rather represented a grey area where law and morality collide with human limitations and the corrupting influence of war itself. Many historians argue that SS actions helped create the conditions for the hatred they later faced, because their crimes and their image shaped how Allied soldiers reacted when the war was coming to an end. By marking themselves by wearing distinctive SS insignia, and in many cases by carrying the SS blood group tattoo, they could be identified more easily than ordinary troops, although the tattoo was not universal, and it became less consistent later in the war. By committing atrocities throughout the war, they built a reputation that preceded them and shaped how Allied soldiers viewed them before any personal contact occurred. There were also battlefield fears about false surrenders, which are forbidden under the law of war, and even the rumor of such acts could make troops treat any SS surrender with deep suspicion. And by running and guarding the concentration camp system, the SS showed the brutal endpoint of the ideology they served, and that reality shaped how many Allied soldiers understood the SS by 1945. They revealed the ultimate destination of the ideology they served and demonstrated the depths of human cruelty they were willing to plumb. When Allied soldiers encountered SS troops in the final months of the war, they were not meeting just another enemy unit, but rather confronting men who represented everything they had been fighting against, and their response, while not legally justified, was perhaps psychologically inevitable given the accumulated weight of what they had learned about the SS. The dark reason captured SS soldiers were shot was ultimately both simple and infinitely complex. They had made themselves into something beyond ordinary soldiers through their ideology, their actions, and their distinctive markings, and they had committed acts so terrible that when they finally tried to surrender, the accumulated horror overwhelmed the rules meant to protect even enemies, and the SS discovered too late that reputation has consequences that no amount of surrender could erase. If we imagine that farm boy from Kansas living into old age, returning to his fields and cattle, and trying to build a quiet life after the war, we might picture him sitting on his porch one afternoon in the early 1990s, when his grandson came home from college after studying World War II. The young man might have asked a question that veterans had avoided for nearly 50 years. "Were they all bad, Grandpa? Every single SS soldier?" The old farmer might have sat quietly for a long moment, looking out over land he had worked his entire life, and when he finally spoke, his voice would have carried memories that never fully faded. "I don't know, son," he might have said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I've thought about that more times than I can count, and I still don't have an answer that feels complete. Maybe some of them were just boys who followed orders, or believed what they were told, or didn't think they had another choice." He might have paused, and his grandson would have waited, sensing that something heavier was coming. "But this is what I can't forget," the old man might have continued. "They wore those symbols that marked them as part of something different. They stood guard at camps, or fought in units that burned villages and shot civilians. Even if they didn't do those things with their own hands, They were part of it, and they helped keep it going. When we saw what had been done, when we walked through those places, we understood something very clearly. Choices always have consequences. The grandson might have asked whether the executions were right or wrong, hoping for a clean answer that fit into what he was learning. But the old farmer might have shaken his head. Some questions don't fit into neat boxes. He might have said, "All I can tell you is what we did and why we did it. You'll have to decide the rest for yourself." As the war moves from living memory into history, we are left with the duty to understand those choices without turning them into simple lessons. The reasons SS prisoners were shot reveal something unsettling about human limits, and they remind us that under extreme horror, even deeply held principles can fracture, leaving ordinary people to carry decisions they never truly escape. If you find this historical exploration thought-provoking and want to learn more stories from World War II that challenge simple narratives and examine the complex reality of warfare, please subscribe to our channel. Each week we bring you deeply researched accounts that honor the experiences of those who lived through history's most devastating conflict, while grappling honestly with the moral questions it raised, questions that remain relevant today. Click the subscribe button below and join us as we explore the human side of history, one story at a time.